Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is our regular monthly reading wrap-up and TBR video, and the first video that you guys on the main channel here are seeing with my updated office setup. I did get new background corner bookshelf here and moved some things around in my office to accommodate that, and I'm very happy with how things look there. I just realized I'm implicitly spoiling a little bit of the video over here. Yeah, I have a little bit of a new background, finally able to show off for the first time. Both of my Sun Eater posters in the background have Volca and Hadrian. Very happy about that. Just generally in love with my new office setup, and also in love with my reading this month, because that's the topic of today's video. And January went fantastic, to just kind of introduce the month. I don't want to spend too much time here before we jump into what I actually read, but I want to say that January went incredible. I've mentioned it no small number of times over, this entire month, basically, in almost every video, talking about, even in many months last year, but 2025 did not go well for my reading in regards to a lot of things for various different reasons. But to put things into perspective, I read only around, I think, not counting rereads, I think I read 23 books in 2025, which compared to 45 or so books in each of the 3 previous years was a little bit of a drop-off, right around half as much, and only like 3 of those 20-something books that I read, if I'm not mistaken, were 5 stars, and if there were 3 5-star reads that I actually got through, one of those was like a 4.5 that I rounded up to 5 stars for the purposes of Goodreads. So relatively speaking, 2025 was not the most successful reading year for me in basically any way, shape, or form. Compare that to January 2026, this month that I just had, and I read 4 full books, plus a little bit of extra stuff on the side, and 2 of those were 4 stars, 2 of them were 5 stars. So I had 2 straight 5-star books in 2025. I've already had 2 of them in 2026, and furthermore, those 2 5-star reads that I read this month, I am 99.9% certain that both of them will end up on my Book of the Year list at the end of 2026. So just January was a really, really great month, and alongside the office overhaul and a couple other personal things, I managed to succeed with a lot in January. But the reading is the one that we're going to talk about a little bit more today. So let's jump into it. Starting off, of course, with all the books that I actually read in January, The Three Musketeers I did properly read in January. Now, I did technically read the preface, the 1 or 2 page author's preface or something like that, in December, a week or 2 before the end of the year, but I didn't actually start the book proper with chapter 1 until January 1st, and while it did take a little while to get through this, I want to say it took 2 weeks or so. I think it was 14 days worth of reading or something along those lines. And it didn't need to take that long. It could have been a little bit faster, but between personal stuff, a lot of personal stuff going on in my life, reading has been hit or miss depending on my time spent per day. But I managed to get through this in just a couple weeks and loved basically every single second of it. And furthermore, as I will discuss in, I believe it will be a review that will be coming next week. I think next Tuesday at the time of this video's release, I'll actually be reviewing this proper, and that's my longest video review of any book that I've reviewed on this channel. And mind you, I've reviewed basically every book that I've read. I make that a point to do. So that should put into perspective the type of impact that the end of this book had on me, particularly the last few lines of that last chapter, really gut punched me, was something that I really needed to hear, made me very emotional, and I get emotional about it in next week's video, in fact. Needless to say, I adored this thing. This was one of those 5-star books that I mentioned. This will absolutely be amongst my Book of the Year list. And I thought that it would be a surefire contender or surefire answer for my Book of the Month, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit later. Following my completion of The Three Musketeers, I did move into Sphere, the second book here, as my next read for the month, and had a great time with it. I really enjoyed reading this book, but it kind of fell along the lines of what it really did was it made me understand what Crichton actually does for me as far as my reading. Crichton is kind of like a comfort read in some sense, where his books are relatively simple. There's not a whole ton going on with them. He does some good work with them. They're interesting. They are very fun. They're popcorn books. There's not necessarily a whole ton of sophisticated stuff going on with these things. But I always appreciate reading them because they're so different from literally everything else I read, not least because the way that Crichton approaches the storytelling and everything else about his books is just kind of different. And that's something that I really like, really appreciate, and sometimes really just need at certain points in time. And Sphere was a book that I was able to enjoy reading for that reason in January. Really liked it. I liked parts 2 and 3 a lot. There are moments of this that felt like a combination of like Project Hail Mary for reasons that are spoilery, as well as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for reasons that if you've read the book are very obvious. And overall, while I didn't love the climax, I thought that the ending worked pretty well for what the book was doing, and a lot of that mystery, like parts 2 and 3, were just really great. So I enjoyed Sphere a lot, but it was definitely nothing that's going to end up in my book of the year list, we'll say. Something else that I could say the same thing else for is Cujo, the next book that I read by Stephen King. Honestly, a lot better than I expected it to be honest with you. I was thinking that Cujo would end up being a kind of a disappointment, the way that it seemed like a disappointment for many of my friends. A lot of people put this as like kind of middle of the road King, despite how iconic it is. And so I kind of went into this thinking that maybe, I wouldn't love it or something like that. And I came out really enjoying it. I think the beginning of it kind of struggled a little bit because it didn't feel like it had that Stephen King magic that I was expecting for whatever reason. I don't have any proper way to really explain that or to really detail what that actually means, but the back half of this came around, and the intensity of the story and understanding what this book is as well made me enjoy it a lot, because while Cujo is a book about a rabid dog going on a rampage, that's not actually really what the book is about. It's more a family drama with regard to a couple of specific families, and the rabid dog just kind of throws a wrench in things for both of those families, and that's kind of more of the conflict device of the book rather than being what the book is about per se. So if you understand what the book is about, and I kind of came to understand that after 100 pages, I was like, okay, this is what the book is doing. By then I was able to appreciate it for what it was, and the back half is where the actual rabid dog rampage does a little bit more of what it's doing on an on-the-page plot basis. The part of the book that everybody knows what it's doing, and that effectively works with the mechanics of the rest of the book in ways that I really enjoyed. I thought Cujo was really good. It's by no means a favorite King book, but I liked it more than Firestarter, for example. But next up, we're going to talk about the fourth book that I read in January and the other 5-star book, the other contender for Book of the Year. And this is Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami. I was recommended Murakami, or talked about Murakami with Reen, a personal friend of mine. And he was kind of worried about me going into this one. There are some books that he recommends to me based on, what I like and what I don't like about certain things. And he's also very good at trying to make judgments of books for other people's reading tastes to the best of his abilities. This was one. Murakami is an author. This book specifically was the recommended starting point for him, for me, but this was an author that Reen was kind of worried about me giving a shot. He really had no idea where I would actually fall with this, but I think that knowing, again, kind of a little bit of what this book was doing ahead of time helped me to not get the whiplash that I could see it causing for a lot of people, because this is a book kind of told in two different storylines. There are two different storylines, and they sort of have a convergence. They don't properly actually converge as far as coming together in a plot sense, but they are connected in ways that is very satisfying to discover over the course of the book. That's one of the things about the book that I loved so much. But the way that this book blends and fuses a whole bunch of different genre stuff, there's general, just common, basic like, realistic fiction isn't really a genre, and it's not really something that you could describe one of the storylines as being. But like, if you take, you know, a contemporary fiction book and take that kind of setting and like add a little bit of magical realism flair to it, add a good bit of sci-fi flair to it, and then have another storyline that is kind of in conversation with this, where there's a bunch of similarities and between them, and this other world is a little bit more like fantasy and with a little bit of that magical realism flair still in there. Like, there's, and I know that magical realism and fantasy are kind of related, but if you read the book, you kind of know what I'm saying. Like, it feels more directly fantasy because of that particular location that storyline takes place in, but it has the magical realism flair, like I said, that kind of connects it in ways to the other story. There's just a lot of things that Murakami is doing with Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World that is really cool and interesting, and I'm 100% certain I will never read another book that is exactly like this ever again. And maybe that's a little bit of why I loved it, but overall everything about what this was doing just worked for me. You know, there's a little bit of a question mark with regard to one particular character and that dynamic with the main character that people aren't going to love. This book is not going to be for everybody anyway, but that particular element might put some people off to a pretty extreme degree. But overall, I was not bothered by that particular thing for the rest of the book to absolutely hook me. I was expecting this book to take me like the rest of January, basically. I had 1 week left of the month to read this, and I was expecting for it to take that entire week, and I read it in just a few days. I read this very quickly and loved it. I just couldn't stop reading. Again, I could just say the same thing 1.5 million times. I loved Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World, and moving into the Book of the Month section, it is actually incredibly difficult for me to decide which one of these two books is my book of the month. It's like, you know, they're so different. They're doing different things. They worked for me for different reasons. The Three Musketeers was one that gut punched me emotionally and that I needed to read for emotional reasons. Has my favorite close in all of fiction. Made me emotional, made me cry, like in ways and for reasons that I don't think any other books have made me cry off the top of my head. It's one of the few books since I started this channel that I can think of off the top of my head that it's made me cry. If I were to make a video about books that have made me cry, this is one of like 2 books that I can name off the top of my head right this instant that did that. Kingdoms of Death is the other one right there. But this one just came to me in a place and at a time when I really needed it, and that's a lot of why I love it. But it's also a really good book in its own right. I just know that there's a little bit of why The Three Musketeers worked for me that is a little bit more like timing. Like I needed it specifically when I read it. It just happened to work out that way. Whereas Hardboiled Wonderland and The End of the World is just something so diverse and interesting and unique, and every element basically still really clicked for me in ways that I was totally not expecting. It's not like The Three Musketeers where I expected to enjoy that book and then I just happened to like it a heck of a lot more than I did, and a lot of that was the way that it came around in the end. This was one that I was enjoying and loving right from the very beginning. Like I can barely point at anything about Hardboiled Wonderland that I disliked, whereas there are a couple moments of The Three Musketeers where it's just like, you know, maybe I had a little bit of question marks as far as that particular thing went at that time or something like that. I don't know if that makes any sense. So realistically speaking, it's like, how do I compare these 2 books and decide which one is the book of the month? I don't know. I'm not going to do it. These are both my book of the month for January 2026. The part of me that knows that both of these books will end up in my book of the year list here in a year's time will be the one to have to worry about that. I will determine over the next 12 months where those 2 rank in accordance with each other and with some of the other books that I read over the course of the year. But those 2 were just phenomenal, made January really, really great. But that's not everything that I read in January, actually. Those were just the 4 books. I also read a little bit of a short fiction secret thing from Christopher Rocchio over the last couple of weeks. I think at the time of this video's release, it will have been within the last week. That was really good. I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not sure how much I actually can say about it. All I can say is that it's not Sun Eater related. And I think that when people get their hands on that, they're going to be really impressed. I was really impressed. I don't just say that because I'm biased, even though I am biased, I know. But genuinely, like, the writing of that particular thing really impressed me and did things in ways that I was not expecting at all, and just frankly immersed me probably more than anything else that Christopher's ever written. I don't know if it's my favorite thing he's written. I don't even know if it's my favorite short fiction thing that he's written, but it really immersed me in ways that nothing else has, and I gotta give props for that. I really hope to be able to talk about that a little bit more in a less vague detail at some point in the future, because wow, that story was incredible. But the last other thing that I did read in January was I did finish The Girl from the Other Side. I did start this manga in December. I read Deluxe Omnibuses 1 and 2. I read Deluxe Omnibuses 3 and 4. Omnibus 3 had volumes 6 and... had volumes... How does math work? 7 and 8. Adds volumes 7 and 8, which I really, 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 really loved. Loved those two volumes a ton. Were my favorite volumes of the entire manga. And then Omnibus 4 had volume 12, a little bonus volume that was just kind of cozy side stories. That was a great way to wrap up the story, and overall enjoyed this. You know, I think that there were various different ways in which the manga worked for me and other ways in which it didn't, but I overall really appreciated the entire series, and I will talk more about it here in a few weeks when I review Girl from the Other Side as a whole on the channel. Like I said, that'll be in a few weeks, but I don't feel like I need to say much more about it, because most of what I need to say about that series I've talked about in videos up to this point, and the review is to come. So we've wasted enough time on last month's reads and book of the month. I realized that I talked about my book of the month section before actually finishing last month's reads. Let's discuss my plans for February. I do have a somewhat ambitious reading month planned ahead of me, but I think it's fairly doable if I can keep even like 3/4 of the reading pace that I managed to maintain in most of January. If I can keep that up, I should be able to get through all of this. So here goes nothing, I guess. The Gathering Storm by Brandon Sanderson is the 12th book of the Wheel of Time, and the first book to talk about here, because I have actually technically started this. At the time of the video's release, I am almost certainly about 1/4 of the way through it, but at the time of my recording this, I'm not quite 1/4 of the way through it. I'm only about 100 pages into it out of 750, so whatever that percentage is, but I'm really enjoying this. I think that this prologue was a huge step up over the last few prologues from Robert Jordan, not least because the prologue was actually fairly short, reasonably sized. I was able to read the prologue in a little over an hour as opposed to 4 hours like the last two books. So there's that. Sanderson's prose seems to be a good bit less bloated than the last handful of books of the Wheel of Time have been, and that's nice. Even though the actual like storyline following the characters, the POVs, and the events of what's happening feels like Wheel of Time. There's no instances so far, because I've only read up to chapter 6, I believe. So far, there's not been anything about the book that has seemed significantly off from Jordan's work on the series, so I have to give Sanderson props for that so far. I've been surprised by that, even though that's what everybody says, is that he does a really good job with everything except for Matt in The Gathering Storm. I haven't had a Matt POV yet, though, so, you know, I can't make that determination. But everything about this has felt significantly Wheel of Time, despite moving along at a slightly more efficient clip and being less bloated in the prose and with a much better prologue. So that has been really nice. But anything else that I have to say about this, I will talk about next month when I'll have surely finished. I'm excited to be continuing the series and to be on this last leg of the journey. Some of the other things that I plan to read this month, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read like each quarter of The Gathering Storm and record its reading diary for each Thursday for the channel, and then I'm going to take a few days away and read one of these shorter books in between before I move on to the next week's worth of reading in The Gathering Storm, instead of plowing through all of this in just a couple of weeks and then moving on to other stuff. So that's kind of my plan, which means that here at the time of this video's release will probably be around the time that I'm starting to read Penance of Blood, Oathbreaker Penance of Blood, by a member of the Sun Eater fan Discord, AJ Drummond. I believe the tag on Discord, he's known like by Sovi or something like that. This is a story that was originally being published, that he'd been writing, that he's been doing as like sort of web novel form on Royal Road, if I'm not mistaken, but it got picked up by a proper publisher. And so this is the first book that got re-edited and refixed up, touched up for publishing. And we decided in the Discord in the Red Company to do this for a read-along for February of this year. And so I'm going to be reading this along with the read-along. And given that it's less than 300 pages, means that that's pretty manageable. I should be able to get this done in just a few days, maybe even just a couple, depending on how quickly it reads. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to it. I don't really know much about what it's about, but the general concept, this artwork is really fantastic. This is the artwork that he's been having done for it on Royal Road. It's just very good. I'm looking forward to giving this a shot. No idea what to expect, all things considered, other than hopefully to enjoy it. On a sort of short story side of things, even though these are technically books, I have Percy Jackson's Greek Gods and Greek Heroes that I would like to read. These were actually both in my TBR in 2025, but kind of fell by the wayside because of how poor 2025 went as a year in general. And I think that maybe each morning when I've read a good bit of, maybe each morning or evening, I don't know, I might read like just a chapter or a section of one of these books, because they're basically like little stories from Percy Jackson's narration, kind of talking about and explaining some famous Greek gods and Greek heroes. So they're not like proper novels, but they're Percy Jackson stuff. So I want to read these and actually read them proper, because I haven't read these yet. I think that I'll do a pretty similar thing, like I said, read a quarter of The Gathering Storm and then go through and finish whatever I haven't read in one of these collections. And maybe I only get one of them read, maybe I get both of them read, maybe I get neither of them read. I have no idea, but these are on my radar to try to get done over these next couple months, so I thought I would talk about them here today. The last thing that I have on my list to try to read in February is actually a very big surprise pick. It's because there are people who were bugging me about reading this a bunch a couple years ago, and it really ticked me off to the degree that I just didn't even want to read it anymore. But Reen, a good friend of mine, does love this book, and tried once again convincing me to read it. Not like personally, it was more as a joke than anything, but I was like, well, I do own the ebook, so I might give it a try because it's short. That is Perfume by Patrick Zuskind, and yeah, I know a bunch of people who've read this and really enjoyed it. I have no reason to believe that I won't enjoy it. It was just me being petty because I was annoyed by the people who were constantly recommending it to me a couple years ago. But I went through and actually saw that the audiobook a couple of weeks ago was on sale for like $3 or something like that. I went ahead and listened to the sample of chapter 1, and I was a fan of the audiobook narration and the way that it started in general. I was like, you know what? I think I'll read Perfume this year and just throw it in as a random short read if I have time at some point over these next few months while I'm reading The Gathering Storm. Because overall, I didn't necessarily put a whole bunch on my TBR these months on account of wanting to read Wheel of Time and finish that up. And if I don't have time to read stuff, I don't want to be pushing stuff back into perpetuity like I did for a lot of last year. But yeah, Perfume is one that's like, if I have time this month between some of this other stuff that I've got going on, there's a chance that I immersive read Perfume since I have the audiobook for that. It's like only a 9-hour audiobook, which means it would take me like 7.5 hours or something at the speed I listen. That's honestly very doable to fit into like the end of the month or something if I have time, and I am genuinely curious to give it another shot. Early in the month, there were talks about different like buddy reads and stuff in a personal friend Discord server, and that included a bunch of shorter books, and books that were personal favorites of various other people in the server, and I decided like, hey, I want to hop on and just kind of include some of these in my TBR this year if I can, just because they are short, you know. Being able to include a random one-off that is pretty shorter in the pretty short in the TBR every once in a while is really nice. It's really satisfying to do, and Perfume was one of those. So again, if I have time this month, I do want to try to actually read that, unironically, you know. My arm wasn't twisted into doing this. I just genuinely decided, you know what? I think I do want to read it now, so I want to read it. But anyway, not sure how much I'll be able to do with all of this in the grand scheme of things because of Wheel of Time taking a lot of time, and also because I may be starting a new job this month. That might actually be happening. There's been some complications with getting the actual process all the way done, but depending on when I start that job will probably put a massive hit on my reading time, just how much time I can dedicate to it each day. So while I am still free, while I still do not have that job, while I'm still unemployed, I'm going to be trying to continue to read as much as I possibly can these next few weeks. Next couple weeks, this week, I don't know how long, just as long as I'm still unemployed, just try to plow through as much as I possibly can so that it all works out. But yeah, I have rambled a lot in this video. I decided to let myself just talk about everything as much as I wanted to talk about it today, whereas the last few of these updates I've not spoken as much about each book as I feel like I probably should for, you know, a wrap up where I'm actually talking about the books that I read. So I don't know if this video is going to be any good. I just know that it's going to be a lot longer than I planned for it to be, or rather a lot longer than the last few of these have been. But I felt like it was for good reason. I had a really great reading month and was excited to just be able to talk about everything. And I appreciate you guys for watching. If you did so, it genuinely means the world to me. I really appreciate being able to just do this. It's been 4 years now that I've been doing BookTube, and now in my 5th year of doing it, and that's something that feels really special to me. So again, thank you to everybody who watches and gives me a reason to do this other than just, you know, the enjoyment of doing it. You give me that extra reason, and I appreciate that. But I've rambled on once again way too long, so I'm gonna cut this video off here. Thank you so much again one final time for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.